Is it okay if I talk about Satan for a few minutes? Is that all right? I'm not sure. I've been here, it'll be 18 months this week that I'm here, and I'm still figuring out what I can talk about and what I can't. All right, that's might be a little exaggeration, but there's some truth to that. It's just figuring out how does this congregation work and what's the history been? Have we talked about some of these topics? And I want to start out talking about Satan and the devil and Lucifer and all this stuff because we need to, both in the context of the book of Revelation and in the context of making sense of our world today. There is this broad range of how we think about the problem of evil and how we think about the devil. A number of years ago when I was in seminary, I had this class called, it was an elective class, and I needed some more credits, and it was taught by one of my favorite professors, and it was titled something to the effect of The History of Christian Thought About Evil. And so we talked about how people have viewed the problem of evil and the devil over the centuries. It was fascinating. I learned a ton. And he said for the final project, he said, you can do anything you want. It's just got to be this number of pages and related to the class. So I said, great. And I thought to myself, what can I do that won't get me stuck in the library for 30 hours that would be interesting and still get a good grade? And so I asked the professor, can I go interview a bunch of pastors and find out what their experiences have been? And he said, yes, that's a great idea. Do that, and make sure you interview the bishops while you're at it. I'm like, yay? The people who are going to decide where I get to go for my first call as a pastor, and I get to go ask them if they've ever met the devil. Oh, good. But here's the funny thing, is from a practical standpoint, that project was so helpful to me. Because I met the whole range of the devil is just a symbol so we can comprehend evil to almost full-on dualism at the other end. I remember at one point talking to a bishop, and he had been a missionary in Madagascar. And he told me that he had once seen an exorcism when he was serving as a missionary. I go, oh, fascinating. I said, because this is what I learned to ask. How did you perceive that experience? And he said, well, this man thought he was possessed, and then he thought he was cleansed. Like, that says more about you than it does about the experience. To all on to the other way of the other end of the spectrum, there was a couple of girls I knew who from my home church who were in college at the local Baptist college, and they had got themselves in a situation where they were convinced that their dorm room was infested with demons. And I met everything in between. And I tell you that because we need just to understand what we're looking at. The Bible and the world don't make sense if we don't understand what's going on. It's just true. You can't read the Bible without thinking about this question. Because Jesus talks about the devil on a number of occasions. He says, I saw Satan fall like lightning before time began. And we read the Last Supper narrative, and it says that Satan entered into Judas. There's all these passages. And our world doesn't make sense. The way I like to explain it is that for a number of years, Google said their self-driving cars didn't cause any accidents. But if you looked into it farther, what they meant is their self-driving cars were in accidents. It was just other people's faults. What they didn't say was that they were in accidents because they didn't act like a human driver. We all know how it is. You pull up to a roundabout or you pull up to a four-way stop and you see the pedestrian over here, and the pedestrian technically has the right of way, but they're looking over the other way. They're talking to their friend. They're looking down on the phone, and so you pull through the intersection, and the guy behind you pulls right through the intersection. What the Google cars would do is follow the law to the letter. They'd stop, they'd wait for the pedestrian, the car behind wouldn't realize that they were waiting, and the self-driving car would get rear-ended. That's the situation we're in this world. If we don't account for the actions of something other than ourselves and God, things don't work out the way we expect them to. Let me give you a practical example. A number of years ago, it was my day off, and I got a phone call. And in this congregation that I was working at the time, it was, if I got a phone call on my day off, it meant there was a real emergency. So, of course, I picked it up. And it was a colleague of mine, and he says, I have a situation I need your help with. I'm like, okay. He says, you know, and he names this person. And it's somebody we know at the congregation who I don't know real well, but I know by sight and by name. And I've had a number of pleasant conversations with her over the years. He says, well, this person, they're off their meds, and they're thinking that they are being afflicted by demons. Like, oh. He says, I'd like you to come with me. We're going to go over to the house and get her some help. And I'm like, okay, we can do that. And so we go over to this house, and there's her and her husband, and they're in their mid-50s, I think. And I'd be talking to this person, and she would go from having a very pleasant conversation with me, and we'd be talking about this, that, the other thing. How are the boys doing in school? You know, how do I like California versus Minnesota? I'd be asking her if her kids still live in the area. And in the blink of an eye, her eyes would go unfocused. And she would be seeing stuff in the room that I was not seeing. And she was absolutely convinced there were demons there. And then we go on for like that for a few minutes, and we talk about that, and we talk about the promises of Jesus' protection and how God is greater than the one of this world. And then she'd blink again and go back to normal. And I want to be very clear in this, that when I talk about mental illness and mental health and depression and everything else, all that stuff is real. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying anything that the doctors say or that medical science says. I'm not denying any of that. What I'm saying is there's another set of issues beyond that. Now, after a couple hours there, we eventually spent a lot of time praying for her and got her admitted to the local psychiatric hospital. But I am convinced that beyond the psychiatric issues, there was a whole nother set of issues. And if we're in a space in this world where if we don't deal with both sets of issues, we get in real trouble. And we're not understanding how the world works. I tell you all that because this is key for understanding how the book of Revelation works. And this gives us insight into this world. The very end of the book of Revelation, which we've been looking at for the last 5 weeks, or 5 weeks including today, we get this passage. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophets were. And they were tormented day and night forever and ever. This is the final fate of the devil, which gives us understanding in how the devil works today. A number of years ago, I heard a very good analogy for how the devil works. And this analogy works so well in the Midwest. The devil is a raccoon. We've all had experiences with raccoons, haven't we? This is the Midwest for okay? I can tell you mine from Boy Scout camp. Fundamentally, raccoons are just 20 pounds of mean, aren't they? Yeah. Okay. They look cute, but they're just mean incarnate. And what happens with raccoons when they get backed into a corner, when they've got their back against the wall? They stand up as straight as they can. They arch their back. They bare their teeth. They look as big, as imposing, as scary as they can be. But fundamentally, if you have to bet on a human with tools versus a raccoon, I'm betting on the human every time. God gave us the opposable thumb. It's the same thing with us versus the devil. It's not us. It's Jesus versus the devil. This is another passage that we get out of Revelation 7. I'm blanking on the passage, but out of Revelation, where there's the war in heaven and Satan is cast down. And again, it's prehistory because it is looping back and forth in time. But what we are seeing in this is that Satan is cast out of heaven in the beginning. And here in this passage, Satan is cast out of earth. Satan wants us to think that he's big, wants us to think that he's powerful, or wants us to ignore him altogether, because that's when he can do the most damage. But fundamentally, he is just trying to make the best of his time here before he's destroyed. And so what I want you to know is in the spiritual conflicts that we have in this world, the battle is already won. Jesus has won this battle when he died on the cross for us. And what we're dealing with now is the mop-up. After the Battle of Midway, there was no way the Japanese were going to win the Second World War. But it still took another 3 years of fighting. We're in that same position here, where the battle was won at the cross, and it's just taking our time until the final victory is won. Now, there's one more piece of this I want to get, actually two more, but one small one here. Part of, I think, why we are having so much anxiety in this world is there are all the people who are trying to sell us on the catastrophes, the things that are going to happen, and it's going to be awful. I was thinking about this the other day. When I grew up, everybody was convinced the world was going to end in nuclear war. And ever since that day, well, considerably before it, there was always the different catastrophes that were going to happen. I thought about creating a list, but I didn't want to get into an argument over which ones were real and which ones were just media hype. It's a long list. And what I was thinking about, and what somebody so well articulated recently, was when all these people are trying to sell you the end of the world, sooner or later they're trying to deliver. Sooner or later they're saying, you know what, all this stuff that we've been talking about, it's now, and it really is the end, and all hope is lost. And so much of our media and social media environment, and so much of what makes life so unpleasant, is all these people who are convinced everything is over and that we've lost. And what this book reminds us of is no matter how bad things are now, God is in control and God has won. Let's go to this passage that Penny just read for us. It's one of my favorite images in the whole Bible. The angel showed me the river of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb. And on either side of the river, the tree of life. And this passage goes on to extend about how this tree of life bears fruit for the healing of the nations. Now, we tend to think of stories as beginning, middle, end. But the Bible isn't. It's beginning, middle, beginning. How does this work? How do we start the story? In the garden, in paradise, face to face with God, with a tree. How do we end? In paradise, face to face to God, with a tree. And this time in between is dealing with the sin and the brokenness of the world. In the beginning and at the very end, in Genesis and Revelation, we end in the garden, in this place where there's no sin, no pain, nor sorrows. And often we make this mistake of we treat this world of this time here as simply a waiting room. And we say, I got my ticket out of here. I am stuck in this purgatory, and I'm waiting for my plane ride out of here. How many of us have felt that way at the airport? Okay. Got to be here for 3 hours for a layover, and I hate this place. Okay. Unless it's Chicago, in which case you've got 20 minutes to get from one end of Chicago Airport to the other end of Chicago Airport, and it's longer than anybody can go. Okay. But you spend that time in the airport, and you feel like I'm just biding my time. But that's not what the Bible tells us. What the Bible tells us is we have this world here that is bookended by paradise. And the cracks are filled with the grace of God. There is this interesting art form they have in Japan where they will take broken pottery and rather than replace and patch it with stuff to minimize the cracks, to make it look like there was never a crack there, they will fill it with gold. And so those seams, those cracks, those wounds become these places of brilliant luster. And I think that's how God works in this world. Those places of pain and sorrow and breakthrough become the places where God's word, God's hope, God's love shines through. That weird experience I was telling you about earlier, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it was a powerful reminder for me of how great our God is and how his power breaks through in the weirdest and strangest ways. How many times have we been in those places where you're sitting there thinking, I don't know how I'm going to make it through? And some person operating in the grace of God lifts you up and carries you forward. How many times have you had that where you don't know how you're going to make it through the darkness of the night? And some Bible verse, some promise of God just comes into your head. Or some song of God's power sings you to sleep. My challenge for you is to see the promises of God and the different ways that he breaks through in this world, and to see the hope that he has for you. This is going to be an amazing week here at Shepherd of the Hills. We've got Vacation Bible School. And I'm looking forward to seeing all these little munchkins running around in here, run around outside, and seeing how God works in their lives, and seeing the hope that God has for them as his faith goes on to this next generation. And my hope and my prayer for you is that this book, which has commonly been regarded as scary and hard to understand, has been an encouragement for you and has given you hope in the strangeness of this world. Amen.